I'll tell you two quick stories, Chris, about this book, what it did for me. It took me on this path. It brought me into these communities. Manny was having a celebration for his life. So I go to this church. I figure there's 500 people there. I think I'm the only white person in the whole place. But then all of a sudden, the master of ceremonies introduces this one guy named Bob Capone, this little Italian guy, about 5'8", comes walking down the middle, and everybody stands and applauds for this guy. Turns out he and Manny worked together at Central High, which was a predominantly black. He was there the day after Dr. King was killed. It was instrumental in keeping these kids under control that day. So I introduced myself, and he goes, "Oh, you're the guy writing that book?" I said, "Yeah." I said, "Can we talk?" I said, "Yeah, sure." So we talked probably 12 times. Well, about a month ago, this other guy who went to Central, who's a white kid, said, "Hey, Bob Capone's wife died." So he sends me the thing, and I know she had MS. And I said, "Oh my God, pick up the phone." I call him. I said, "I'm so sorry about your wife, Bob." He goes, "Oh my God, I can't believe you called." I go, "No, believe me, I had to call. You're part of my life now, right? You helped me with my book." And he goes, No, I mean, I can't believe you called right now." I go, "What do you mean?" He goes, "Well, my wife's funeral this morning." I went, "Whoa, wait, your wife's funeral was this morning?" He goes, "Yeah, about 2 hours ago." I go, "Oh my God, you must have a house full of people. I'll let you go." He goes, No, there's nobody here. But that's the point. He said, I get emotional just thinking about this. At the funeral, this woman comes up, and she's got something behind her back. She gives me a hug. She reaches out, and she hands it to me. And she said, "I just finished this thing. I think you should read this. It's really good." And it was your book. And I went home, and Bob says, "I'm going home to this empty house, and I'm dreading it." And I walk in, and I sat down at the kitchen table. I still have my coat on, and I haven't stopped reading your book in 2 hours, just leafing through it. And I haven't thought once about my situation. And he says, "And here you are calling me."
Hi, I'm Chris Waddell. Welcome to Living It, the podcast where we join experts in the experience of being human. Be bold. Say yes to adventure. Say yes to living it. Welcome to Chris Waddell Living It, where we talk with experts in the experience of being human. Those people who've taken the risk to realize their dreams and live fully. Today, we have a good friend of mine, MC Antil, who has recently written Floor Burns, Love, Passion, and the 1967 Syracuse All-City Championship. It's an amazing read, but I want to take a little step back because it's not the only thing that he's done. He was in baseball working for Bill Veeck at the Chicago White Sox. Bill Veeck, who was one of the iconoclastic owners who changed everything. He was at ESPN, New Channels, division of publishing of the Newhouse, a fledgling cable talent group, moved to CTAM, where he learned about brand, ESPN, where he was the director of corporate communications. This is interesting too. After he left ESPN, he did MC Antil's Cable Folks, where he profiled executives and offered readers a combination of news-making achievement and personal backstory. He also wrote speeches. And in writing speeches, one of the biggest speeches that he wrote was for Sheila C. Johnson at the Democratic National Convention endorsing Barack Obama. So this is speeches on a really high level. This is a guy who's done a lot of things and has written an amazing book. MC, thank you for joining us. It's an honor and a joy just to see you and get to talk to you.
Chris, you make me sound a whole lot better than I am. Trust me. Okay. Nobody of your viewership and listenership needs to be intimidated. Okay.
No, they do. I'm intimidated. I want to make sure that I can do justice to you and your story. The reason why I think it was so important, though, to talk about what you've done in the past is that the last time we talked, you quoted Samuel Beckett. And I might have you quote Samuel Beckett, but I want to know if all that stuff that you did before was preparing you for the book that you just wrote for Floor Burns.
You know, it's weird. You say that. I kind of think, I think you've gone through this too. Everything that's happened to you in your whole life is preparing you for this right now. It was funny. Just 2 weeks ago at Christmas, I was at a friend of mine's house, and I love this guy. He's an old South Side Italian guy. We go. I don't have family out here, as you know. I'm from upstate New York. I live out here in Chicago now. But I went over there and we were talking. We were having some drinks on Christmas Day, and I go down there and I just love the family, old, huggy, you know, South Side Italian family. And he says, "Man, you look good." I said, "I feel good, Bob." He goes, "No, because you got something going." I go, "Bob, I can't explain it, but I'm 68 years old. I think I'm finally hitting my stride." And I really do. I mean, I kind of think like, wow, I can't wait to get up every day, because I get smarter every day finally, after so many kissing so many toads and going down so many dead ends. But it's really weird. The one thing I always did in almost everything that I did in life, I was a pretty good little writer, and I just never ever had the guts, because I was brought up in that nuclear 50s and 60s where get a job with a big company. I did a little theater. I did all these things that were sort of made my mother, who was a traditionalist, really cringe. You know, like that's a nice little hobby, but you really can't do that for a living. Get yourself a job with a nice big company. And for the longest time, I did that. And then I was at ESPN. I remember this clearly. I was at ESPN, and I was really tired of the corporate rut. And ESPN by then had been bought by Disney, and it just didn't fit in with the Disney culture. And we're sitting there one day, I remember this clearly, and there was this thing that came across. They're going to have to lay people off, but before they did that, they were going to accept voluntary layoffs, and they were going to pay you some money to go away. And I'm like, ooh, 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 it's me. So they gave me some money, and I remember I left the ABC building on Upper West Side of Manhattan on June 11th or July 11th of 2001. And I told myself, I'll give myself 2 months and I'll start looking for work. And I was true to my word. 2 months after July 11th of 01 was 9/11/01. I lived in the Upper West Side. The whole world changed. And suddenly this decision to become a freelance writer didn't look so smart. And I was in New York from a year, hemorrhaging money. And then I went to Chicago, where I had lived immediately after college. And that's when I sort of started moving in the direction of becoming a, quote, full-time writer, which is what I am right now.
How did you come across that Beckett quote? Can you quote it for us?
Yeah, the Beckett quote is I will tell you what, and I don't know why I did this, but when I was just gotten out of college, there was I had these Irish poet calendar, and the one for December, which was my birthday, was Beckett. And there was this grizzled old picture of this guy, and he's staring right into the camera like he's daring the cameraman to cross him. And the quote is, "My best years may be behind me, but I wouldn't want them now. Wouldn't want them back, not for the fire in me now." And I always had that there, and I don't know why. But over the years, it's been gone. I've lost it, but I've never lost the quote. It's always lived in my heart. And now I know exactly what Beckett was talking about. You know, I wouldn't want my best years back, not for the fire in me now.
Are you admitting to yourself now that you're a writer? Were you not doing that in the past? I mean, is this living your mother's kind of like go to a big company, get the gold watch, that kind of thing?
When I told you, like, I would be working in the marketing department of this cable company, and they would have me write stuff. And it was copy, and it was just, and I was getting awards for it, but that wasn't my primary job. You know, my primary job was something other than, but they would say, "Hey, we need some copy for this." And I would write it. Or we would have Christmas parties. I would write entire state plays, right? And MC's good at this. Let them do something for the Christmas party. And I did that, but it was a part of my job, right? And when I went to ESPN, and I would have all these kids who come in as interns, and I would tell them, look, every person in the world writes a press release from their perspective. It's all hyperbolic. There's adjectives and adverbs galore. I said, here's what you need to do to learn to write a press release. You write a press release with just the facts. You write a good solid lead, and then give a supporting quote and let it go. And I said, make it so that if an editor was on deadline and your release came in and he looked at it, he read the lead, he would go, here, just run it as it is. Write it as a journalist, not as a hyperbolic marketing guy. And so this guy was editor of one of these, you mentioned the Cable Facts. He was the editor of that little publication, and it was a daily publication. And he said, man, when your press releases come in, we like share them with, because that's how a press release is supposed to. You're a really good writer. Would you be interested, if you ever left ESPN, of a column? We'll give you a weekly column. I'm like, oh, that's a start. Yeah, I'll do that. So that was my first step into like doing it full time, diving in head first, going, well, this is it. I'm a writer. No other way of making a living. It was a pretty ballsy move, I got to tell you.
Well, it's kind of like the Stephen Pressfield kind of thing, right? The war of art, like admitting that you're a writer is the first step. And sometimes you don't necessarily, you write and it's not like, well, what have you done? What, are you in my bookshelf? Are you not? And you're like, no, I'm a writer. This is the process. This is the profession. This is who I am. How much of it came from like those early years with the White Sox with Bill Veeck too? Like, I mean, he's so known for like the Eddie Goodell thing, but he did so many things that to me were essential, were the essence of what the sport was about. I mean, like helping to reconfigure Wrigley Stadium, right? Based on how you want to watch a game, how the game is supposed to be watched, and sort of the inverse relationship, right, between how expensive your seats are and how much you actually know about the game. How much of that played into, because you were in the space of genius there, right?
Yeah, it was, I'll tell you what, it's funny you mentioned that, because over the years, I didn't have this belief early on, but over the years, I believe that everything in life is free except a good story. And the better storyteller you are, no matter what your profession, the more you'll get paid. If you're a doctor, you have a good bedside manner. If you're a lawyer, your summation is a compelling story that makes the jury or the judge, whoever, just go, wow, I like that story a lot. And so you have to tell a good story. So I'm going to take you back 40 years. I was a bartender out of college at this Hotel Syracuse bar. And I just wanted to do something with my life. I was getting home at 3 and 4 o'clock every morning, 23 years old, and I got to do something with my life. And so I did the boldest thing I've ever done. I called up the Atlanta Braves and I told them that if Ted Turner would interview me for a job, I would walk to the job interview as a publicity stunt. And
from Chicago?
From Syracuse. I was living in Syracuse, okay, New York at the time. And it was 14 below zero when I left Syracuse. But they were like, really? I'm like, yeah, I'll do that. And so actually, the boldest thing wasn't the walk. The boldest thing was the fact I was a 23-year-old knucklehead bartender. And I called a press conference. And they all showed them. All the press showed up. Because, some guy, I'm sitting there two-fingering a press release saying that I'm walking to Atlanta because I want to work in baseball, right? And so fast forward, Ted Turner there's a word to use in Chicago, is a jag-off, right? He was just a jag-off. He never would accept my calls. When I got to Atlanta, there was nobody there waiting for me. Even though the press, I had been on a bunch of national things and I'd gotten a lot of publicity. I'd done my job, and he was just a jerk. He walks into this is on opening day of the baseball season in '79, and he orders a vodka at like 11 o'clock in the morning. And my last name is pronounced Antil. And he's like, comes walking in, there's 50, 60 people in this little room up there because Bobby Cox was going to give a press conference for the team. And he goes, hey, where's Antil? Pronounce my name like Antil. Where's Antil? I'm like 23-year-old kid with a flannel shirt. Everybody else has got blue blazers and, ties on. I'm like, I'm down here, Mr. Turner. He goes, well, Antil, you walked all the way down here from New York, huh? I said, yes, sir. He says, how's your feet? I said, well, not bad. I just walked, 1,000 miles, but they're okay. He says, where are y'all sleeping tonight? Antil. And everybody starts cackling. And he's laughing. And I'm like, wow, this is not how I expected this thing to go. And he goes, he said, where are y'all sleeping tonight? I said, I just got into town. I really don't know. He says, I'll tell you what, Antil, since you're such a big baseball fan, why don't you sleep by home plate tonight? And he was just being, as I said, a jagoff. And I'm in there, and it's the third tier of the old Atlanta Fulton County Stadium. And I walked outside, and I went to a payphone. I put a dime in at the time, and I said, "Can I have the number of the Chicago White Sox?" And they give me the number. I call up, and I called Ted Turner 50 times, Chris, 50 times. Never talked to him once until he started cackling at me. And I said, there's this little woman on the switchboard. Back in those days, they had one of those 2-plug switchboard things. And I said, is Bill Veeck there? She goes, hold on. Hello? I go, Bill Veeck, speaking. Bill was he's yelling at me because he's sort of deaf. Speaking. I go, Bill, my name's MC Antil, and I've done this, blah, blah, blah. He goes, you did what? He goes, well, I walked down here, and Ted Turner just walked out here, jerked me around. But here's the deal. I said, I started out in upstate New York. I got a ton of publicity. I was in local television in New York and Washington and Philadelphia. I said I've been on Paul Harvey News, NPR, and I said about the AP. All these different major sources want a follow-up story. Here's the follow-up story. Ted Turner was a jerk. You heard about it. You knew why a kid would want to walk 1,000 miles to work for a baseball team. And you came to my rescue and you said, hey, kid, come to Chicago. We'll talk to you. And he goes, when can you get here? I go, I'll be there tonight. He goes, does that mean you're not walking? I go, no, I'm done walking, and there's this long pregnant pause. He's like, I go, does that mean I don't have my interview? He goes, no, you got your interview, but you tell him just the way you told it to me right now. I said, okay. And that's how I got to Chicago. It was on the basis of a good story. I told him a good story.
I mean, that's a great story. And it's funny because people look at the idea of, okay, worked in the front office of a baseball team. That's especially starting as a young kid. That's signing yourself up to be an indentured servant kind of thing. I mean, like, this is not, there's nothing glamorous other than your association with the game, right? You get to work really hard and probably sleep under your desk. And if you have a desk.
Chris, if you added up the value of the clothes on your back, including your glasses right now, that's probably more money than I made in a month. Okay. Seriously. I was making no money, but my very first day, and because the Bill's office wasn't an office. We had this cool old place called the Bard's Room, and there used to be a place called the Stockyards Inn back when the Stockyards were a thing in Chicago, and there was a restaurant there. And Bill they were tearing it down, so Bill took the guts out and put them in Comiskey Park and so we had this bar where the media and the employees used to eat, and it was all mahogany and these gorgeous old Sally Rand, Carl Sandburg, all these old Chicago icons on the wall. And I came walking in. I was going to the men's room, and I walked in, and there in the corner, my very first day, is Bill Veeck at 10 o'clock in the morning with a beer in front of him, and sitting next to him talking is Studs Terkel. And I'm going, this is going to be a really cool job. This is like, I really like this job, So,
and I'd have to imagine that the appeal of you walking to Atlanta is something that he saw a kindred spirit in you too. Like, hey, this guy might do something that I'd do.
Yeah, I think his son Mike, who was sort of a rock and roller, and Bill always said, "Hey, if Mike wants you, good by me." So Mike and I sort of connected, but the walk got me in, and then I realized that if Ted Turner didn't buy this thing, the one guy I know who would was Bill. Bill at the time was really scrambling to try to put together a team, so the front office stuff was not necessarily anything he was focusing on. We were trying, we had no money because Bill had bought the team right before the free agency ruling. So the economics of the game changed, which is why we had no money to speak of. We were doing it with smoke and mirrors. But Mike took a shine to me, and Mike and I talked music a lot. He's a music geek. And so he said, I like this guy, let's hire him. So that was it. That's how I got in the door. But Bill's insight and Bill's name and reputation got my foot in the door, opened the door for me.
I would imagine, and that was his program though too, right? Was to go buy distressed teams and build them up in terms of the product that he was putting on the field, but also in terms of entertainment, because you're talking about, it's about telling a good story, but it is about entertaining, and in entertaining, you're considering your audience, right?
It was all about everything Bill did was focused on the fans. I mean, literally, I don't want to say literally, but figuratively anyway, all decisions ultimately had Bill sitting there making decisions and this figurative fan right next to him. I'll tell you what was great. People don't know this. It's like one of those great falling through the crack moments. But Harry Carey was our announcer, right? And Bill went to Harry one day in the Bard's room after a game, and literally, when I tell you, like, I would sit there and like Ted Williams would be there, and Eddie Matthews, and like all these great old ball players, right? Hank Greenberg, and because they would just come in to see Bill, George Kell. So one night, everybody's sitting there drinking beer, and my buddy Bobby, the guy who was I was telling him I was just hitting my stride. Bobby was the bartender up there. So I would go behind the bar and work with Bobby once in a while, help him out, right? And we'd just sit there and drink beer and listen to Bill and Ted Williams talk, right? It was just flying the wall stuff. And one night, Harry goes, I'm sorry, Harry's in there and he's drinking a beer, and Bill goes, "Hey, Harry, I got an idea." He goes, "Tomorrow night in the 7th inning, we're going to drop a microphone down, and you're going to reach out and you're going to lead everybody in a rendition of Take Me Out to the Ball Game." And Harry goes, "No fucking way, Bill." He goes, "Come on, you're going to make me look like an asshole." And Bill's got his contract. He goes, "You have a personal services clause right here, Harry. This is it right here, baby. You're doing this thing." And Harry was like, his head down. He's like, you're gonna embarrass the crap out of me. And within 2 weeks, it was a thing. Within 2 weeks, people were coming to games just to see and sing with Harry. And then he went to Chicago, he went to the North Side and started doing this for the Cubs, and it became an international phenomenon. But it was amazing to watch how Bill, they had a whole thing. The Wrigley, the Ivy and Wrigley, that's Bill. Harry Carey, that's Bill. Bill wanted to have, he wanted to move the St. Louis Browns that he owned to LA. And they're like, there's no way. He wanted to sign Satchel Paige in an entirely Negro League team to play in LA. And they're like, no way. That's never going to happen. You know what I mean? Bill was so far ahead of the curve on stuff like this.
But he integrated the American League too, right? When he was with Cleveland with Larry Doby. And
Larry was around the office a lot. It's funny. I was in New York once, and in an event with Rachel Robinson, and I said, "Hey, Miss Robinson, I'm friends with." That's when I was working with Sheila Johnson, and I said, oh, I said, I used to work with Larry Doby. And I said, we knew Larry as just one of the guys in the offices, but until recently, I never knew that Harry integrated the American League, or that Larry integrated the American League. And she goes, it's a way different thing than Jack. And she sort of bristled. And I was like, ooh, I danced a little too close to her legacy and Jack's legacy. And she was going to defend Jack for all she was worth. And I never brought it up again. But when you think about it, what poor Larry Doby had to go through, there were cities that didn't have a National League team. So, so in Cleveland, for example, Larry goes, well, that's the first black guy they ever saw in Cleveland, right? In Washington. There were other cities that did not have National League teams. Plus the fact this is only about 2 or 3 months after Jackie Robinson. So it was incredible what Larry had to go through, but nobody remembers that. Nobody gives Larry any historical, thumbs up for what he must have gone through. And he was just a guy in the office to us,
Being second. I mean, being second is second. And in a lot of ways, it doesn't matter how closely behind, because there really needed to be that one person who is the champion in a lot of ways. But Jackie had a connection to Syracuse too, right? Had played his minor league ball in Syracuse around the time that you were around in the 60s, right? Or no.
Jackie was Jackie. It was funny because this book that I've written, it's really the story. It's a basketball game, but the basketball game is a hook to tell you the larger story about what happened to the city when they took Interstate 81 right through the heart of it. And where they put it is right through what was called the 15th Ward, which was the black neighborhood. And when Jackie, the year before he broke the color line, he was playing AAA in Montreal for the Royals, which is the Dodgers AAA farm system. And they and the Syracuse Chiefs were going head to head for supremacy. Well, when he would come to town, he couldn't stay with his team in the hotel, and there was an old Negro League player named Jimmy Fay, I think was his name, and he lived in the 15th Ward. So Jackie used to stay with him, and then there were all these great little taverns, these African American taverns that Jimmy Brown and Wilt Chamberlain, because Syracuse was an NBA team, and Jimmy Brown was from Syracuse. So all these huge African American athletes would go there and listen to jazz, and the clubs would stay open all night long. But Jack would never ever venture out of the ward because he didn't dare go to a place that served alcohol because of what Branch Rickey had warned him about ever getting into it. Like the whole world was watching him. So Jack spent his nights in the 15th Ward. And actually, at one of the games in Syracuse, one of the fans, when Jack was up, took a black cat and threw it out right in the middle of the field. And this black cat, and the whole place, roared and stuff. And it was not a shining moment for my hometown.
Not a shining moment in your hometown, but how do you look at writing this book? Because you're talking about race. You're talking about the transformation of a city as well, right? That had been sort of this crown jewel for a long time, but in the mid 60s then was starting to evolve. But it also, in so many ways, it sounded like a love story.
Oh, it's very much a love story
to your heritage, to your hometown.
I've never written anything, Chris, about which I've been more passionate. And there were times when I would literally be almost in tears writing, because I was writing with such great affection for this place. And I'd like to think that I was being honest about it, but like we were writing about the 1960s. Back then there was two sides of the Vietnam experience. There was, make love, not war. Then there was America, love it or leave it. And there's one part of us that had this sort of binary thing that if you're not saying great things about this country, you must hate it. And in my case, I said some really hard truths about my hometown. And there's some people back then who feel, oh, you just hate Syracuse. You're just dissing Syracuse. I'm going, it couldn't be any further from the truth. I love this place. And I'm just trying to keep the Syracuse that I grew up with, that helped shape me as a man, as a writer. I wanted to bring it back to life. And so it was an amazing, almost spiritual journey, doing all this research, piecing all these little pieces together as I put this book together.
How much did you know? Because I think growing up, you knew, this is this part of town, this is that part of town, these are these characters, and your characters, in so many ways, it's so visual. I mean, it's like you've done the writing, but it's like I can see it, just talking about, like, the clouds dropping anchor in Syracuse, the Friday night fish fry. To me, I mean, I couldn't help but that brought me back. The Friday night fish fry actually brought me back to, like, to that Chris Christopherson song, the Sunday morning coming down, where he's talking about crossing the street and the somebody's frying chicken, the smell of Sunday frying chicken.
What an amazing comp. I never really thought of it. That's why that song always resonated with people, because, like, the guy who's the mayor in the book's son reached out to me and he says, I can not only see and hear the Syracuse that I grew up with, but I could smell it. And it was weird because I never realized that I had that component to my writing, but people like yourself just reached out, just saying, how did you do this? Because I could see it in my mind's eye. And I've never been a visual learner. I've always been an oral learner. So in my own mind, I hear the book in my mind or my ear. I don't see it. I don't see the images. But every once in a while, I did this little technique, like Billy E., the guy who was the coach on one of the two teams. Billy E. had glasses all the time. So every once in a while, I would have him finger his glasses up his nose. And when I do that, people are like going, wow, I'm there. I could see it. You're not just explaining what was happening. I suddenly see it. And this is one little thing I can hold on to. And by the way, quick aside, Billy E., the guy who was, there's probably no central character in the book. He's probably as close as it comes. Billy just passed 2 days ago, 2 weeks shy of his 95th birthday. He's down in Florida. So a little toast to Billy E., who I couldn't have done without him.
Most assuredly.
Chris, is, I talked about this thing being a spiritual journey. I was raised a Catholic, and I'm certainly not much of a Catholic now. But this one priest, he's a Monsignor now. His name is Chuck Fahey, and I always tell Chuck, I know I'm getting old when I can call him Monsignor Chuck, but he would say, he says, this is amazing. You're writing like 4 books here. You got a basketball book, you got a book about the Catholic Church, you got a book about the building of a highway, and then you got this building about 60s culture, 60s youth culture sort of blossoming, right? He says, you're like writing like 4 books. I go, well, I guess technically I wrote 5 books because it is in so people can see it's a 5-book set here. But he said, you're doing the Lord's work here. I said, what do you mean? He says, well, he said, these stories of these little shards of information have all been out there for years, decades, and nobody's ever bothered to put them together. And he said, you not only have found them all like Humpty Dumpty's eggshell, but you sat there for like 10 years and pieced them all together into a narrative. And I said, I got to tell you, Chuck, I can't figure it out, but I get up every morning and I can't wait to get to the computer, because I sit there and type, and the story's in there. I'm like, oh my God, here we go. And I go, I don't know what's getting into me. He goes, I do. I go, what? He goes, that's the Holy Spirit. And I said, Chuck, I'm a recovering Catholic, and I'm not sure that that's true, but I'll tell you what, from this point forward, that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. So I was guided by the Holy Spirit. That's the way I look at it.
He's done his job too. He's got that little twist in you, and you go, "Oh,
Yeah,
maybe."
maybe, maybe.
I thought it was
Maybe,
Samuel Beckett, but maybe it's the Lord. Okay.
yeah, maybe I'm not such a great writer after all, right? You know what I mean?
Well, I mean, that's the way that artists often talk about it too. It's not necessarily yours. It's something that comes through you oftentimes, and you're as much a vehicle. But that's what amazed me. I mean, you talk about the five different elements, and it's the five different elements. I mean, it's 1960s Syracuse. It's the city, it's the evolution of the city. I mean, certainly, and painting the picture of Syracuse as being more blue collar versus Rochester, which was more white collar, and the pride of the blue collar, the pride of going into the fish fry on Friday because they are Catholics and they're going to eat fish, but knowing that you have 2 days, off. And so basketball and race, but so much of this is also exactly what we're seeing within our society right now too, right? Just the bifurcation of our country, and the pride in being an American, and being and working hard and sweating, and the broad backs, and and putting yourself into it, and the people who do things as opposed to thinking things. And how do we create all of this? And what I loved was the mastery of the essence of the city and how the puzzle pieces fit together. But it's the story of the game and the story of the city, but it's also about the people and the right way to look at the world. I mean, it's kind of like you're giving us an elevated view of being able to look at the world and see how everything comes together, because oftentimes we're also lost in the minutia of our lives and our days, that we don't see how the pieces fit together. How were you able to achieve? Because I'm assuming that there was a part of it that came from your upbringing. It was part of what you knew growing up, but then complementing it with that research to get this sense of mastery that people go, "Oh, okay, I had lived in Syracuse and I understand it on a visceral level, but I don't know if I understood it on a cerebral level."
You know, it's really interesting, Chris. When I grew up, I thought Syracuse was all I ever knew. 8, 9, 10 years old. I was living in the near western suburbs. It was the city limits line was blocks from my house. Even though I was in the burbs, I was relatively close to the city. But Syracuse was like, it was Mecca. It was a thing. It was an internationally important city. And I'm not trying to be hyperbolic. I'm telling you, Carrier air conditioners were made there. There was a church, the baking, Arm & Hammer baking soda was there. There was Smith Corona typewriters were made there.
Half the typewriters in the country, right?
Half the typewriters in the country were made there. Marcella's Casket. There were at least 40 different factories in Syracuse. There was so much money coming from all over the world into Syracuse. At 162,000 people, Syracuse had a professional theater company. They had a professional opera company. They had an internationally known art museum. They had a symphony orchestra. It was astounding that this little city that, but for the university, might have been called Utica, was internationally known. And it imported literally every ecclesiastical candle in every church in the globe was made in Syracuse, New York. I mean, specialty stuff. Stickley furniture was made in Syracuse, New York. Oneida silver was made in Syracuse, New York. Iroquois china, Syracuse china. It was all made there, and everybody had a job. As a matter of fact, that's why the Black population in Syracuse grew so exponentially, because these migrant workers, these guys were coming up from the South, they'd come up for seasonal picking work, and they'd look at all the factory work, paying 4 times what they're making, and it was backbreaking factory work. But they're like, nope, I'm staying right here. And so this little 15th ward, which was built for 5,000 people, pretty soon had almost 16,000 people living in the same space. And in the 1950 census, a third of the homes there didn't have running water. So it was really two different worlds. There was the ward, and then Syracuse proper. And so, as I've told people, this book really started out as a book about basketball. It ended up being a story about the highway, because once they determined that the highway was going to go straight through the heart of the ward, it started to trigger the white flight to the suburbs, because admittedly, these houses were older and probably needed to come down, but there was no accommodation given to any of the Black families that were living there, because most of them were tenants and they weren't being compensated. So they weren't given money to move. They were just said, here, you got to move. Well, nobody would rent to them. So suddenly there's almost a borderline homeless problem in the 1960s. And as they started creeping into these neighborhoods around the highway that was being built, it triggered the white flight to the suburbs. And that's the point at which the whole city changed.
The whole city changed, and the basketball game is central, or basketball is central to Syracuse. I mean, with the university, you had the professional team at the time, the Nats, and but also sort of this the parochial league versus which is, I mean, you're talking about this tiny little school, right? I mean, it's what, like 18 kids or something like that?
Here's the thing about the parochial league, and this is what, and I've never found, there was one league I found sort of in Denver that was kind of close, but no city in any that I found in the entire country had this. Excuse me. But in every other city, Chris, and this is one of the things that your listeners and viewers should know, every other city in the country, there were these network of Catholic grammar schools. And then after 8th grade, they would be channeled into these regional, larger Catholic junior and senior high schools. Well, in Syracuse, they had this, it was a factory town. You had these 10 little schools, all of them Catholic, all of them not K through 8, but K through 12. And they were all based in neighborhoods. So you had your lower class Irish neighborhood, your upper class Irish, your Ukrainian neighborhood, your German neighborhood, your Italian neighborhood, a Polish neighborhood. And these kids would play for these teams alongside kids that they went to kindergarten with. From 4th grade, they've had the same classmates, the same teachers, the same nuns all the way through. It was like a factory system. You took these little souls as 4-year-olds and you taught them and by the end of the thing, they're ready to come out a polished young Christian soldier, right? Catholic soldier. And so it was a factory system. And the new bishop, a guy named Walter Forey, loved it and he went to bat for it. Didn't matter. The whole country was building regional Catholic schools. And Forey loved this little system. But then after Vatican II, we went over there. He had a meltdown and he was probably getting early onset. And he came back home and they sort of quietly took his power away. And as they did, the bishop underneath him, a guy named David Cunningham, started breaking ground on these big suburban schools, Catholic schools, and they started siphoning. Not only were there's the white flight to the suburbs, but these schools were siphoning the life out of these 10 little Catholic schools, neighborhood schools, and then one by one they started to go. And so this game was the final all-city game. At the end of the year, the winner of that parochial league would weigh the winner of the city league. Well, the city league schools kept getting bigger and their teams blacker as the years went on. And so by the final year of which year I'm writing about, this little Polish school had like 19 boys in the senior class. Corcoran probably had 700 in their senior class, right? And so it was sort of a David Goliath story, except Sacred Heart had a team of big, strong Polish kids, and they were not David by any means. These kids they had 3 kids that played Division I basketball. They were all like 6'5", 6'6". It's a really interesting mix, because you'd think that the black school was the favored, and they might have been, but not because they were the better team. It's just that these big Polish kids were just tough. So it's the book is about that one game with all the background that
Well, it's about that background. And you talked about the education, taking these kids from 4 years old through 18, but basketball was a big part of that education too, and playing the
it
game
was huge.
properly. How did you find a way to wrap your mind around this whole story? Because it is, I mean, because obviously you did exhaustive research. It's not just, you just didn't sit down and say, well, I'm going to write about this. How did you wrap your mind around it? I mean, it's such a big story.
Chris, when you and I were seeing each other on a pretty regular basis, I had already started this thing, and I would lay in bed at night, even out in Vail, Colorado, thinking, how am I going to tell this story? There's so many moving parts. And I'm like, I'd be starting to write it, and I'm like, how am I going to fit Father Brady into this thing? So for people here, there was this priest named Father Brady, who was he was in Syracuse, New York, before World War II. He was a small town guy. He went to the South Pacific, where he was assigned to be chaplain for a bunch of soldiers and seamen, including large number of black soldiers and seamen. And he was watching the valor with which these kids fought and died for their country. And he knew damn well that back home, there's people who would lynch them. These kids were giving their lives for people who would lynch them. And it changed him forever. And he came back to Forey, to the bishop, and he said, I can't do this anymore. Can't go back there. And he said, I want to go to the 15th Ward. What do you mean 15th Ward? He goes, well, we send missions to Uganda or Tanzania or whatever to say, convert souls. Why don't I do that in the ward? Forey goes, okay. So he sends him to the ward. Well, he became what they called the Saint of Syracuse. He took the word of God out of the pulpit into the streets. And so as I'm writing all this other stuff, this basketball stuff, this highway stuff, I'm like, oh, where do I fit Brady in? Because he's essential to this thing. As a matter of fact, the two starting backcourt and the black team were both kids brought up Baptist, but they converted and they were altar boys under Brady. And I'm like, I'm not even sure I can fit that in, but like everything was folding back on itself. You know what I mean? So I'm like, wow. Jimmy Collins, who was a great basketball player, voted the best in the history of the city, told me one time, he says, Brady wanted me to be an altar boy. I said, Father, I'm not Catholic. He said, don't worry about it. You know what I mean? It's like, don't worry about it. Come on. God doesn't care. You're serving the Lord. Who cares what religion you are? But Brady was really cool. He was really cool.
I mean, just amazing, because he would go and walk around. I mean, just walk the streets, right? That was his.
He would put food on the hood of his beat up old car and let people come out and take it. His old parish gave him. There were other two things that were made in Syracuse were Nettleton shoes, which were world famous for their quality, and Learberry men's clothes. So they bought him a Learberry winter coat and as a going away gift, and a pair of Learberry shoes. By the time he got to his humble little home, he had given both away to homeless people. You know what I mean? He was just a truly remarkable guy. Truly remarkable guy.
Remarkable. And so you found a way to wrap all these people. I mean, that's the whole writing thing, right? Is kill your darlings kind of thing, right? But you found a way to make the pieces work, because it is such a character-driven story.
Yeah.
In the game, we're looking at these kids, right? So these kids are kids. They're in this huge game, but these kids, these people who were kids then, are pushing 80 right now.
Right.
If
Yeah.
they're still alive, as you're writing, and the story's been etched. The story's been etched, since the 60s, since 67, right? So as the writer, do you find yourself cheering for the characters in the story, for the players in the game, because you know how it happened? I mean, you mentioned Jimmy Collins, right? So there was the foul against Jimmy Collins, and you're like, as the writer, are you going, oh well, I hope Jimmy Collins doesn't get fouled, or I hope
Right.
he's
That's interesting. I didn't think of that the basketball thing was anything other than just a hook to get people in. But again, so people know, I wrote this thing online. So I would finish a chapter and I would put it up online, and I would crowdsource my accuracy, my grammar, all the other stuff. People would say, hey, page 32, blah, 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 you got a typo here. I would fix it. Well, this one guy used to be the editor of the local Arts Weekly, lives up in Seattle now, reached out to me. He goes, my God, you gaslighted me. I go, what? He goes, I read 30 chapters and I'm waiting to see who won the game, and it's not up there. I go, well, it's not done yet. He goes, I'm done. I did the whole thing to find out who won. And it occurred to me, wow, I really do have a little bit of a whodunit here, or like there's gotta be an element of drama to this thing, because you want to know who wins. So part of me, one of the teams has to win, one of them has to lose. I truly fell in love with all the characters on both, and especially the coaches on both teams. It was weird. The guy who was the coach on the black team was a white man named Kenny Hoffman, who's a simple little farm boy. And I don't mean simple in a mental way. I mean just simple in his wants, his life, his needs were all simple. And he was just really straightforward and honest.
Well, it's simple but essential, right? I mean, it's just what is important. What's the priority?
To watch how these black kids responded to this guy. When he died, his wife told me that the line wrapped around the funeral home, and she says, Kenny would love the fact that there were as many black faces as there were white ones out there. They love this guy because he always went to bat for them. He always was there for them. Well, he lost a few heartbreakers or whatever, but it was weird when everybody had this notion of what my book was going to be like, because this parochial league back in Syracuse is still this thing that people love it. And they had this notion, this sepia colored image of what they wanted this book to be. So everybody had their opinions about what they wanted to do. And so I was telling Kenny Hoffman before he passed, I said, Kenny, I'm really torn because I want to do this thing, but people are like, there's part of me wants to do a history of the league, and there's this other social element. I just don't know where I want to go with it. And he goes, MC, he says, let me tell you something. It's your book. You tell your story. If they want to tell a different story, let them write their own damn book. And so when Jimmy Collins and I were talking years later, and Jimmy was named the greatest player in the history of Syracuse high school basketball, we happened to be talking, and I congratulated him. And I said, but can I tell you something? I never would have said this years ago, but you and I share something in common now. I said, what? Yeah, I go, we were both coached by Kenny Hoffman. He said he coached me on my book. And it was like one of the greatest bit of advice I ever got, because it emboldened me to say, no, this is my story. I'm telling it. And he's the guy who made that possible.
It's interesting that you say your story too, that he's saying, tell your story. And he's really saying it, tell it from your perspective, tell it in terms of what's important. But as a writer, even though this is a work of nonfiction, you are really telling your story too. I mean, the story of who you are, the lens of what you're looking through, what's important too. How was that as a journey for you as a writer?
Here's what I'll tell you about that, Chris, and I really mean this seriously. It wasn't, yes, it's partly my story because it is my hometown. So I had this deep personal connection to it, but I haven't lived in Syracuse for years. What I did when I wrote this thing, and I really mean this seriously, it didn't start out this way, but this subsequent to my conversation with Kenny Huffman, I started to write the book for one person. I wrote it for me. What kind of story would I want to? So I love music. So there's plenty of music in there. There's a lot of culture. There's a lot of Black culture. There's a lot of Polish culture because I'm a geek and I love stuff like this. So it was like somebody gave me a Christmas tree and 9,000 ornaments, just said, have at it, right? And I'm like, okay. So I said, because what I wanted to create was a document that, God forbid, the creek don't rise. This thing's around 100 years from now. Somebody who was a 19, 20-year-old kid wants to know what life was like in the middle of an industrial town in the middle of the 20th century. Read this book. It'll transport you back in time. It won't just tell you on an intellectual, it'll tell you on a visceral, on an emotional, on an all-consuming sensual level, right? And that's what I tried to do. So I wrote the book for me, you know.
Really? So you were your audience.
I was my audience. Now, I ironically, I worked at ESPN. I worked in baseball. I'm not a particularly sports nut. I like sports, but I sort of take it with a grain of salt. But I know that sports is a great breaker of ice, right? It's you know, olive oil is the thing you put in food because it allows flavors to move from one ingredient to the next. Sports is that currency that we share as a society. It allows us people very dissimilar to bond over something. Sports is this unifying element. Well, I use sports as a way to just say, okay, get them in the door and tell your story. But every once in a while, we'll use a sports story because if they get a little bored with the history, we'll tell them about a good basketball game. Like, oh, okay, here comes the basketball game. I want to read this now. You know, so that's what it was. It was just a big old hook to get people in. You know.
Well, and it's a tremendous hook, but it's also that sense of, as you say, it's that sense of being there. But you didn't have any other ideas in terms of the audience. You wanted to write. I mean, it's funny because I was just doing a little bit of research on Charles Schulz, and because I just had somebody on who was from Australia, and she was, a day ahead of us, and I'd always quoted Charles Schulz as, saying that the world can't end because it's already tomorrow in Australia, which turns out he didn't actually say that, but it just fits better in my mind that he said
right.
it. But he was saying the same kind of thing, that he does it, and he would say, if it makes me laugh, if I think it's funny, if I think it's silly, then it's good. I'm not asking anybody else. It's challenging with a book to not necessarily have that audience. Like I often talk about, like in announcing, like in skiing, I feel like my mother is my audience in some ways.
Right. Well, there you go. It's the same sort of thing.
Yeah.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
playing to that and going, okay, what would she like? What would she need? How would she take it? And that's kind of the that's kind of, but as you're sitting there, because writing is not public.
Right.
It,
Right.
it is the most solitary thing. I mean, you talk about some of the Irish poets, and there was a fair amount of whiskey that went on with the Irish poets, and sometimes happy hour came earlier and earlier. How do you, as a writer, deal with that? Because you are a charming, charismatic, social guy. How do you deal with the social part of being a
Yeah,
writer?
that was not easy. I got to be honest with you. Now, part of me is a little bit of a geek and a loner, and loves to just sort of, peruse and study. But you're right. I mean, having to get out and communicate with people sort of helped keep me sane. Because Red Smith once said about writing, oh, it's easy. You just sit down at a typewriter and open a vein, right? And it's, somebody says, oh, writing's easy. Yeah, sit down at a blank page and tell me writing is easy. You know what I mean? So there is something about that, but I guess my mantra is, Chris, who likes to exercise, right? Nobody really likes to exercise. You love having exercised. That's the way. I hate writing. I love having written. And it's a trade-off, right? I'll say, the joy of having written more than eclipse how badly I hate sitting there putting 1,000 words down and reading it going, this stinks, you know? Then I'll go back the next day and I'll clean it up. And by 2 or 3 days, you go, well, that suddenly doesn't suck, you know? So, and then you look at it and you go, wow, I did that. And that's what I hold on to, that I did that kind of thing, you know?
Right. And you have to hold on to it before you start.
You have to know what's going to be there, right? And I will tell you, one of the reasons this thing, and again, people should know, I started this book back in like 2003 was my first meeting with these two teams. And I started writing stuff. People were because this is largely an oral history. They were telling me things. I was writing entire chapters that turned out to be bullshit. They weren't even true, because I would read them to somebody and they go, that's not true. I go, what? So-and-so told me. He's full of shit, you know, that kind of thing. And I'm like, and so it was so frustrating because I was trying to get the story right. And you read the piece about the Jimmy Collins foul. You know, depending upon who you talk to, there were two ways to look at that controversial foul call. But I finally said, you know what? I want to just tell it as objectively and as passionately as I can, but not make any judgment on it, and let people decide for themselves. And the whole book ultimately became that. The very same things being the very same event, the very same set of circumstances being told, but viewed through two sets of eyes, one black and one white. And therein lies, I think, I just had a guy call me about 3 weeks ago, and he thought, because he was at the very first game with the controversial call, and he thought, frankly, what I was saying about the race and the racial tension was just not true. He says, I was there, I didn't feel it. But he says, I've read your book, and I've gotten to know Joe Reddick, one of the black players in it. And I lived in this little part of the city that I just thought was Eden. I thought it was Mayberry, right? And Joe told me a few years ago about walking up Glenwood Ave on his way to school at Corcoran, and invariably one person or another, almost every day, would call him a nigger. And I never realized that. And he said, and I realized that in the game you're writing about, I was sitting in this white section, but I wasn't sitting in the other section, right? And had I been doing so, I might have thought differently. He says, and I got to tell you, I didn't like your book, what I didn't before I read it. Now that I've read it, I want to thank you, because you opened my eyes. And I think you've done a great service to people like myself who thought they knew everything there was to know about this situation. You've shown me there's two ways to look at anything. It was really nice of him to say that.
It is. And I think that's one of the remarkable things that you've done is you've helped us to be able to see the essential in the world, you know, because I think that oftentimes we see it through our own bias, or we see it through an historical bias or whatever bias we're applying, and we don't necessarily see the elements for who they are. So you do a tremendous job of that. Where can people find your book? Because it's both audio and now there is a published well, not hardcover, but a printed version.
I'll show you this. This is available. All three are available. If you go to my floorburnsbook.com, it's FLOORBURNSBOOK.com. You can buy it there directly, or they'll have a link to Amazon. It'll take you directly to the pages for both the audiobook and the ebook, the Kindle version. So I'll tell you two quick stories, Chris, about this book, what it did for me. Again, it took me on this path. It brought me into these communities that I had, as a kid, no occasion to ever talk to, ever interact with. And there was this one guy who's this sort of legendary bad guy, badass in the black neighborhood in the 15th ward. His name was Bobby Harrison. Bobby did 2 stints in Attica. One time he got in hand-to-hand combat with a cop and shot the cop in the shoulder with the cop's own gun, and did 2 stints. He was there for the riot in Attica, right? And so people would tell me about Bobby. Black folks I would talk to would tell me about Bobby Harrison, and I said, "Is Bobby Harrison still alive?" "Oh yeah, I mean he's alive, but he's crazy. You don't want to be messing with Bobby Harrison." I'm like, no, I kind of would like to be messing with. I'd like to talk to Bobby Harrison. No, oh man, don't be talking to Bobby Harrison. Hey, he's crazy. And Bobby was just the type of kid. There was one guy said when he was like 14, he and his little dog named Fellow was on a chain, and he was riding around with his bike. They said pimps, gangsters, they would be running. They would not want to make eye contact with Bobby Harrison because he was such a badass. A little guy, but he backed down from nobody, right? So I finally reached out to him. I called him probably 5 or 6 times, and he never got back to me. Finally, he called me one day, and I see the name. I said, "Wow, Bob Harrison." He said, "Yeah, so-and-so said you're writing something." He says, "And you're writing the truth." And he says, "I got great grandbabies now, and I don't want them to think that their granddaddy was just some loser, some punk. I want to tell my story." I said, "That's what I'm here for." So we started talking regularly. Well, the day after George Floyd called, he calls me up. I said, "Hey, Bobby." He said, "Can we talk?" I said, "Yeah." And I didn't say a word, Chris, for the next 45 minutes. He just talked about, this is why I always hated white people, especially white people in uniforms. I never trusted them. They killed my granddaddy, right in front of me down south in South Carolina. And I came up. I never, ever trusted white men in uniform. And I've spent my entire life trying to get over that. And he just was pouring his heart out. This is a guy who did 2 stints in Attica. And I hung up the phone, and I was like, I was moved because of all the people this guy wanted to spare his soul to about this, it was this white guy, right? And I'm like, I teared up. I'm like, wow, that was really moving. And then, so there was another guy. Manny Brilliant was this magnificent guy who sort of knew my dad a little bit, but he was the coach of one of the other black teams in the city. Legendary, first black guy ever to win a scholarship at Syracuse University. But Manny was having a celebration for his life at this place called Bethany Baptist Church. He invited me back. So I go to this church. I figure there's 500 people there. I think I'm the only white person in the whole place. But then all of a sudden, the master of ceremonies introduces this one guy named Bob Capone, this little Italian guy, about 5'8", comes walking down the middle, and everybody stands and applauds for this guy. They come out and they hug him, and they like, who is this guy? Turns out he and Manny worked together at Central High, which was a predominantly black. He was there the day after Dr. King was killed. It was instrumental in keeping these kids under control that day. And I went up to him and I said, I gotta meet this guy. So I introduced myself, and he goes, "Oh, you're the guy writing that book?" I said, "Yeah." I said, "Can we talk?" I said, "Yeah, sure." So we talked probably 12 times. Well, about a month ago, this other guy who went to Central, who was a white kid, said, "Hey, Bob Capone's wife died." So he sends me the thing, and I know she had MS. And I said, "Oh my God, pick up the phone." I call him. I said, "I'm so sorry about your wife, Bob." He goes, "Oh my God, I can't believe you called." I go, "No, believe me, I had to call. You're part of my life now, right? You helped me with my book." And he goes, No, I mean, I can't believe you called right now." I go, "What do you mean?" He goes, "Well, my wife's funeral this morning." I went, "Whoa, wait, your wife's funeral was this morning?" He goes, "Yeah, about 2 hours ago." I go, "Oh my God, you must have a house full of people. I'll let you go." He goes, No, there's nobody here. But that's the point. He said, at the funeral, I get emotional just thinking about this. At the funeral, this woman comes up and she's got something behind her back. And she gives me a hug, and she reaches out and she hands it to me. And she said, I just finished this thing. I think you should read this. It's really good. And it was your book. And I went home, and Bob says, I'm going home to this empty house, and I'm dreading it. And I walk in, and I sat down at the kitchen table. I still have my coat on, and I haven't stopped reading your book in 2 hours, just leafing through it. And I haven't thought once about my situation. And he says, and here you are calling me. And I went, oh my God, Mom, that was, like, again, like, I'm not strong enough for stories like that, Bob. You got to warn me if you're going to tell me stuff like this, So, but it's like stuff like that has been happening all the time, Chris, with this book. And I just, again, like you said, it's not my story. It's just coming through me. But the notion that it's moving me into places that I never would have gone before as a man, as a fellow Syracusan, as just a member of the human race. It's been a gift that I just will never ever be able to thank God enough for.
Well, it makes your story dynamic too, doesn't it? I mean, it's those days that you sit down and say, I'm going to feel better for having written this book, but you're not imagining that all of these people will, one, read it, and two, be touched by it, and three, share that they're touched by it with you, which in a lot of ways, as the artist, you're not necessarily prepared for.
Right.
That part. You're prepared for, okay, give it flight. Here it is. I've done it. Go be free, right. Book, and not for it to come back to you. So just absolutely amazing. How do you, like, when you do some of these conversations, would you record those conversations? Because I'd imagine
I recorded a lot of them, but eventually what I realized is that I would refer to them certainly as a baseline, but the deeper that somebody had a memory or a recollection or something, I would just call them time and time again, and they would tell me stories over and over again sometimes. And each time they would even remember a little bit more, and I would flush it out a little bit more. There was one story in particular, these two young black players were, they came across a trooper who was a racist. I mean, a flat out racist. And one of the two told me a story, and I was like, that's a good story, but I'm not sure I'm buying it. And it took me 2 months to find the other guy. And I finally did. He was in Muscle Shoals, Alabama. And I said, hey, do you remember blah, blah, blah? He goes, yeah. I said, there was a trooper down there. He says, yeah. He goes, could you tell me that story? And he told me virtually the exact same story. I said, okay, I'm good with that now. That's a true story. Because these two hadn't talked in decades, had no reason to like corroborate their stories. But it was, so that was really one of the hardest parts for me, was determine which of these things were true and which were a product of one man or one woman's memory. You know what I mean? So I didn't want to build an entire book on a false.
The arbiter of truth. It's really, there's a lot of responsibility there.
It's a moving target. It really is. And it was funny because somebody called me out on my book and said, hey, these two guys you talk about, like you like, they're great guys. I go, he goes, they're punks. I go, see, here's the deal. If you told me this one guy was a punk, I would have said, maybe I can live with that. But the other guy is not a punk. He's this, he's that, but he's not a punk. You see, but what you just did was you used broad general language to accuse me of something that I am literally laboring over every word to make sure it's accurate, right? And just because it doesn't fit with your memory of this thing, you cannot call me out, because believe me, because I'm using real names and real people, I am super cautious about what I'm writing in this thing, But I will tell you, here's one of the things I should tell your readers and listeners. Why should they pick up this book, or why should they buy an auto? It's Syracuse, New York, for God's sakes. They could be from anywhere, right? But you're from the Northeast. I'm from the Northeast. Virtually everything in this country began in the Northeast, right? And it emanated out over the centuries elsewhere. But from Minnesota to Boston, that Rust Belt over there, for years, that was the epicenter of the American experience in many ways. And even though I'm writing about Syracuse, New York, it could be Allentown, Pennsylvania. It could be, Brockton, Massachusetts. It could be any number of factory towns, because there are certain universal truths. So what it is, I drilled down specifically to Syracuse. I tried to tell it in a way, almost any story that had a universal truth to it. And as such, I think that no matter who you are, where you're from, you'll have a background. You go, wow, I can relate to this,
How much more do you feel that you know now, universal truth, as a result of writing the book, researching the book? I mean, this is decades.
I learned, I think I learned the most, Chris, about myself. As the woman who read the book told me, she said, anybody can start a book. It takes a special kind of person to finish a book. And Lord knows my mother is looking down at me from heaven going, I never thought you'd ever finish that thing. You know what I mean? I started a lot of things in my life, but I just did not finished a whole lot of them. And I think it really, I remember I thought I was having a stroke about a year ago, and it wasn't that. It was a blood pressure thing that was related to COVID, ironically. And but I'm in the back of the ambulance. I remember thinking to myself, I wasn't thinking about dying. I wasn't thinking about anything. The only thing I said was, thank God I finished the book. And it really made me feel like at peace. It was like, oh, whatever happens, happens. I finished the book,
Oh, that is absolutely awesome. And yes, as someone who's started a lot of things and not finished a lot of them as well, I
take a
completely
number, Chris. I mean, you talk about lining around the block. I mean, we all start things we don't finish, but this is one that I knew was because when I got cancer 8 years ago, the book was in the closet. I hadn't touched it for 10 years, and I brought it out and I said, you know what? If I don't tell this story, nobody's going to tell it. And so it was sort of a mission. It was a mission I was on because I wanted to give something back to this city that gave so much to me. It really did. And so I was delighted. As a matter of fact, if any of your viewers or readers or listeners, if you do nothing else, read the foreword. The foreword of the book is the one thing that I would say, if it's not for you, you'll know at the end of the foreword. But if you decide that after the foreword you'd like to read on, I don't think you'd be disappointed, is my point.
No, I would agree with that. And the foreword is absolutely spectacular as well. It really is. And yeah, thank you. I mean, I guess I still, I mean, I feel like I want to end the conversation, but you keep sparking interest in me in the mission that you were talking about, that the book took hold of you. The story took hold of you. You didn't really have a choice. You had to do it. It was related to so much of what you'd done before that you had the skills to be able to pull it off, both in terms of conversation, in terms of interpersonal connection, in terms of the writing, in terms of the storytelling, in terms of a worldview, et cetera, et cetera. You had a lens that could help you see this book. But this gets back to Beckett in some ways, right? Is this what you hope for as a human being? Is that you do these things and they lead to a point where you have a mission, where you're captivated, where you have to do this?
You and I are in a somewhat similar situation, Chris. We don't have any children of our own, right? As such, our legacies are way more complicated than, because if you have children, there's a chance that your grandchild or your whatever will grow up to do some great things. You have this incredible footprint now for all the things you've done in your life. This is the one thing that I will now be able to say, I was here. I got into this world. I was given this set of circumstances, and I didn't make much of it better, but I tried to make this one little bit of it better. And here's a little bit of my soul that will be here for hopefully decades and maybe even centuries, as long as people read. And that this is my evidence that at one point I passed along this path and I carved my name in a tree. You know what I mean? And that's what this book is for me.
I love it. I absolutely love it. And congratulations, but more than that, thank you.
It's my pleasure. And you and I, we've known each other for decades now, and we are we have this thing, and that's why I love talking to you, because you are as intellectually curious as I am. And you know what? The greatest gift a parent could ever instill upon their children is intellectual curiosity. And you have that. My dad gave that to me. My dad had some shortcomings as a man, as a father, but he always gave life the ability to teach him something, and I'd like to think that lives in me. And I think that's the one thing you and I share. And I think that this podcast, I think One Revolution, I think the things that you do with your life are very much reflective of the fact that there's more out there to learn.
Most assuredly there is. And so much of it starts with interacting with people. We're not going to learn it all on our own. I mean, there's reading, there's doing, but people are such a source of knowledge and the thing that will stretch us.
Yeah.
And kind of make it look at things differently. So MC, thank you so much
thank you, Chris,
for joining us. Total pleasure.
I appreciate it. You bet.
Yeah, exactly. And I hope people get to read or listen to your book, and maybe there'll be more in the future. And if there is, we'll talk about it in the future.
Can I tell you real quick before we go?
Yeah, please.
My editor is brilliant, and was like going, because a mutual friend, I was like, oh man, Peter's really good, my editor. And he goes, well, he ought to be. And he goes, his uncle isn't it? He said, well, let me phrase it. His mother is Norman Mailer's little sister, right? And so Peter would blow me away with how he would massage my prose. Oh, well, when we get this thing down to 1,200 pages, 1,100 pages, whatever it is, he said, I'd love to have another shot at this thing. So about a few months ago, I said, hey, Peter, you said to me another shot of maybe thinning this thing down a little bit more. And he says, I'm a little busy, but there's somebody I know. And there's this woman that I went to Harvard with. So she called me about 2 weeks ago, and we had this incredible conversation. She just happened to be finishing up Friday Night Lights right now. And so rather than me trying to convince her to edit my book, she was pitching me on letting her do this. She so believes in this story. She goes, oh my God. She goes, this is blowing my mind. This is I've read 3 chapters. And I'm totally in on this thing. And so I get the sense that this thing still may have a second and third life in a more condensed version for national consumption, and then perhaps as a film production or miniseries.
Makes perfect sense to me, because reading it's so visual, and you have such tremendous characters.
Well,
and the characters in movies and in television are the reason that you come back. They're the reason when something ends that you think, oh, I don't get to share my life with those people anymore. This is over.
The one part about this book, though, is that there are so many characters, and they sort of come into your reality, and then they leave. Sometimes they come back, but sometimes they don't. But they're all part of this fabric of this city that I tried to recreate. The generations, the races, the ethnicities, the religions, the everything, even the little neighborhood saloon moments. I just, they all work together, but it's unlike, as my editor said, Peter said, this is not like any book I've ever really edited before. It's not traditional in that sense. I said, yeah, I guess there's that. So
that's what makes it beautiful too, right? I mean, I think that's so often it's hard to be different, but it's also great to be different.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, unfortunately this is, it's the way God made me. You know what I mean? It's just like it's the reason I left ESPN. I was like, no, I just can't do that. I can't go down that well-worn path. I'm going to take this thing wherever my nose leads me. So far, so good. So
thank you. I imagine your mother's looking down going,
I hope she is. I hope she is. Yeah.
I told him he should go that way, but I really appreciate the direction that he's gone and what he's contributed.
I like to think both my parents are proud of me because I got a lot of both of them still in me, and frankly, I dedicate the book to them. I said, I think the dedication reads, for Mom and Dad for giving me a sense of place, because this whole book is about a place and a time.
Place and time and home.
Yeah.
That's for sure. Well, thank you again.
Thanks, Chris. It was great.
Total pleasure.
Keep up the great work. Seriously, what you do is just amazing. You really, I think there's like 3 of you, right? You've cloned the 3 of you. You're like, oh yeah, well, Chris is doing it. Well, Chris is over in Botswana right now. Chris is like climbing mountains,
Oh, thank you. I mean, that's very flattering, but yeah, no, just trying to keep up. I think trying to keep up and stay curious. That's exactly what we're all trying to do.
Get on the mountain more regularly. That's
the objective.
My advice to you.
I think that's a good advice. That's for sure.
Makes you whole. Makes you whole.
Exactly. And thank you to all of you for tuning in. I hope that you've enjoyed it. And the greatest gift you can give us is tell your friends to tune in. Please subscribe. We'll let you know when the next one is coming, and we will continue to bring you great people and great stories. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for joining us. Please subscribe to Chris Waddell Living It for more stories on the adaptive community, the Paralympics, artists, athletes, entrepreneurs, experts in the experience of being human. Also follow us on Spotify, Apple, Facebook, and Instagram. I look forward to seeing you next week.